Welcome. Hello out there, wherever you are in webinar land. We are so glad you could take a few minutes to join us today as we talk with Dr. Erin Doyle about a vital cog in our animal inventory management system, fostering. Before we dive in, 3 quick points that you've probably heard me say a few times. First, we want to take a moment and give thanks to Maddie's for their support of not only our program, their support of shelters, of cats, and today specifically this webinar. It's very generous of you to share your platform and your resources with us, and we so appreciate it. Thank you, Maddie. Second, as you probably know, this is a Million Cat Challenge Mini Webby. A Mini Webby is a bite-sized webinar, bare bones, to the point. Here's a great tip or strategy and the steps you need to implement it. We promise to get you back on the adoption floor in 30 minutes or less. What that means, of course, is we hold all of the questions until the end and ask that you submit them as they come up to you, and we'll queue them up. Lastly, if you haven't already joined the Maddie's Pet Forum, or you're a shelter participating in the Million Cat Challenge and you haven't joined the private group within the Maddie's Pet Forum, I ask you, what are you waiting for? Do you not have FOMO? All kinds of lively discussions are happening in the forum you are missing out on, and one of them will be the webinar after show, where Erin Doyle has graciously offered to hang out in case you have any follow-up questions later on today or even later on this week. There will be links provided in your resource widget at the end of the webinar, so don't worry. One click and you'll be there where the action is. Now, here to talk today to us about having a plan in place this kitten season is Dr. Erin Doyle. Erin is the Senior Director of Shelter Medicine in the Outreach Department of the ASPCA. She's an adjunct faculty member in the Shelter Medicine at the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine at Tufts University. And she's currently serving her 2nd term as president of the Association of Shelter Veterinarians. With a CV like that, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention she also completed a fellowship here at the Correct Shelter Medicine program, which we can only hope played a part in her becoming board certified in shelter medicine, woohoo, 2 years ago. Erin, I don't know how you have time left in your day to be here with us today, but we sure are glad you are here.
Thank you very much, Mandy. That was a very lovely introduction. And yes, the Correct Shelter Medicine Fellowship definitely played a huge part in getting boarded and certainly in this presentation and all the stuff that I have learned. So thanks so much for that introduction. Yes. And yeah, thanks to the Million Cat Challenge for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here today, and I'm so excited that so many people are turning out for this, this webinar. Thanks so much for being here. And yeah, we're going to talk about foster care on deck, which basically is strategies of how to get our foster kittens out into foster homes quickly. And so just before we dive into the content, so that you can put a little bit more of a face to the name, as Mandy mentioned, I am a Senior Director of Shelter Medicine at the ASPCA, which what that means is that I get pulled in, myself and my colleagues get pulled into shelter medicine topics, both internally and with our external partners. So when I start to dive into some specific strategies, some of my frame of reference is from some of our internal programs at the ASPCA. But I also wanted to mention that before joining the ASPCA last spring, I was at the Animal Rescue League of Boston for almost 11 years. So a lot of my practical kind of in the trenches experience comes from my time at the ARL, and I will certainly reference that later as well. And also putting a plug in for the ASV, wherever I go as president, it's sort of my duty. So if any of you out there are veterinarians and are not members, definitely please consider joining, and feel free to contact me if you'd like more information. And we do actually take associate members as well for any non-veterinarians that are interested in joining. But without further ado, let us talk kittens. So what we're going to cover today is basically the why, what, and how of a foster care on deck system. Why is this sort of thing important? What are we talking about when we say foster on deck? And then how is it implemented? What are some real world strategies? So why? So why is it important? And I should step back and say, I keep falling back into saying kittens, but this is important for any animal that we're sending out into foster care. Certainly nursing queens, but honestly any animal that is going to become part of your foster network. It is important to get them in and out the door quickly. And the reason that it is important to get these guys out of the shelter and into foster home is essentially the same reason it's important to get any of our shelter animals out of the shelter as efficiently as we can and reduce their length of stay. But when we start to talk about our kittens, our nursing queens, all of the animals that we are placing into foster care, they tend to be our most vulnerable population. And so it just further increases the importance of why it is in their benefit to get them out the door. When animals stay in the shelter longer, it leads to overcrowding. You just have more animals accumulating in the shelter. They're exposed to disease, and so they're getting more disease exposure. The longer that they are in the shelter, the more chance that they're going to come across infectious diseases that they might be susceptible to. And then also the longer that they're in the shelter, the more stress they're experiencing. And this applies even to our little guys. You know, they certainly can experience the stressors that any of our animals experience in the shelter. But definitely when we start to talk about our nursing queens, these are going to be some of our most vulnerable cats to the impacts of stress. And while our kittens are in the shelter, our kittens and cats are in the shelter, they're also receiving less personalized care. Despite our best efforts to do everything we can to provide as much care as we can in the shelter environment, it's not the same as one-on-one in a foster home. And I'm getting requests to speak up, so I'll try to speak a little bit louder, but please let me know if that's not sufficient. But all in all, ultimately, the longer our kittens are in the shelter, between all of these compounding factors of overcrowding, disease exposure, stress, less personalized care, it's going to result in more disease. And depending on our foster network and our foster capacity, that can in and of itself then result in a longer stay in the shelter, and you can end up in sort of a vicious downward circle. So that is why this is important to get our kittens out the door quickly. So let's talk a little bit about what we're talking about with the foster OnDeck system. And first, to give credit where credit is due, I learned the term foster OnDeck from the Correct Shelter Medicine program. Back when I was at the Animal Rescue League, we had a consult with Dr. Sandra Newberry, who was at UC Davis at the time, and that was where I first learned this term. So this is kind of my spin on it, my take on it, but it's basically what we're talking about when we talk about foster OnDeck is a proactive approach to managing our foster care system and to expediting getting kittens out into foster. So what this entails, you need to have an organized system. So that's an organized database where you have all your foster caregivers listed in one place. It's up to date. You know who is in your foster network and who is available and who can take what sort of animals. You have a very clear, proactive communication system. You have clear expectations for when these animals are going to get picked up, because some of the onus on getting kittens in and out the door quickly is on us in our communication and our kind of expediting their process. But some of it is on our foster parents, and we need to communicate that importance to them, that it's important that they come quickly to pick up these animals. It also involves planning ahead whenever you can for intakes. Sometimes they come through the door and you can't, but sometimes if you know that, say, you're getting a transfer of a litter from the municipal shelter down the road and they're going to come by in a few hours, that can be an opportunity to plan ahead. Contact that foster parent, have them ready and waiting to go for these kittens when they walk in the door. And as I said, I keep saying kittens because that is the bulk of whom we're talking about, but this sort of system is not just for kittens. Anybody that you are placing into foster care benefits from all of the tenets of this system. Being organized, being proactive, that will benefit not just our kittens, not just our nursing queens, but even our animals we're sending out into foster care for medical or behavioral rehabilitation. The same approach works for them as well. And just to dive a little bit further into the what, we kind of talk about some general tips and strategies that go hand in hand with a foster OnDeck system. A big thing, I'm a very type A personality, so the organization component definitely resonates well with me, but it's super important. You want to have an organized database, and we'll talk about some ways that database, some tools you can use to create that database, but whatever the tool is that you use, it should be organized. You should know it should be somewhere kind of outside of the foster coordinator's mind, kind of who is available, who is ready to take animals, their contact information, their availability. It should be in a very clear, organized format. Having this in an organized format and also monitoring data for your organization can help you to calculate ahead of time. You can calculate your capacity based on your data of how many kittens you're expecting your organization to take in and compare that information to your foster network. So if you can say over the last few years we took in so many kittens, this is how many foster homes we have available this year, how does that pair up? And that enables you to make some decisions about what is your capacity, who can you reasonably care for through your foster network, and again, just to help with some of that planning ahead. Another thing with planning that can be helpful is doing a little bit of categorization. Certain foster caregivers may have some basic skill sets, say like bottle feeding or treating ringworm, or may have certain kind of capacities within their homes, say taking nursing queens. So having basic categorizations of your foster caregivers can help to keep your system organized. The one thing that I will make note with this is that I think that can be a little bit of a slippery slope. So while I think basic categorizations are important, you don't want to fall too much into hand-picking people. I know from my own practical experience, sometimes if you get in a litter that say just seems a little bit unthrifty or you're just a bit worried about, it can be very easy to fall into like, well, let's just see if, Judy's free. I know she can handle these guys. And that can be a slippery slope that can actually hurt your efficiency. And so while it's important to make sure your foster caregivers are appropriately trained and categorized accordingly, you don't necessarily want to fall into cherry picking foster homes for individual animals except in unique circumstances. Communication is also key. Organization is one big component, communication is the other big component. You want to proactively communicate with your foster caregivers. It should be a very clear communication system. They should have some idea of sort of when they can reasonably expect to be called upon to foster. Obviously, there's some variation depending on who walks in the door, but they should know, are they up next? Are they sort of at the top of that queue, that spreadsheet, to know that they will be taking in the next kitten that comes in? Communication is key, and finding a communication system that works for your shelter and for your foster caregivers is key, whether that's email, whether that's social media. Again, we'll talk a little bit about some different platforms that can be used. And personalize the system. What system works for a very large organization may not work as well for a much smaller organization. So figure out the system that works for you. And there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what system you choose, as long as you have those basic tenets of organization and communication. So speaking of systems, the basics are fine with a foster OnDeck system. I first learned this system with just a basic Excel spreadsheet, and that is a totally valid technology and system to use, but there is some pretty neat technology that can help to really refine an OnDeck system. Your core technology is going to be your shelter software, Chameleon, PetPoint, all of the various iterations of shelter software. That's where you're keeping a lot of the information that you have, your foster caregiver information, the animal information. To my knowledge, I have not encountered a shelter that really uses just their shelter software to manage their OnDeck system to accomplish this sort of proactive knowing who's up next to take a foster animal. But certainly this is an important component of the technology. And I want to actually step back for a second to say I'm going to give some specific examples as we, basically after this slide. I'm going to guess that a lot of you out there have also great examples of systems that you use. And so I know Mandy mentioned the forum, and we'll reiterate that again, but I definitely would love for people to share their systems as well. So, but again, small segue, small sidetrack there. But just to mention that shelter software is an important component, but not necessarily the only component. That said, there are some really cool online forms and spreadsheets that can be used to manage this sort of database. I'll give some examples on the next couple of slides, but tools like Smartsheet and Airtable and Google Forms are online survey systems that then can auto-populate the information into a spreadsheet. So you can have systems where, say, your foster caregivers are inputting information into a survey, and that's auto-populating into a spreadsheet that you have access to. So you've automatically got this roster created for you. But But you don't have to get that snazzy. Again, as I said, you can just use a simple Excel document, and that's how I learned the system, was just manually inputting foster caregiver information into an Excel document. And we'll touch on it a little bit later, but social media forums can definitely have a role in a foster OnDeck system. They have their pros and cons, of course, but they're a platform that many of our foster caregivers and many of ourselves are very familiar with. And so they're not to be forgotten when we talk about foster systems. So let me talk a couple of examples, and I'm going to start off with some ASPCA examples. So, oh, and yes, just a reminder to everybody, definitely submit questions. I would love for this to be interactive as we enter into the Q&A portion at the end. And again, feel free to voice if you have systems that work for you or any questions that you might have. But to talk a little bit about specific examples, and I'll just hit on a few. So this is slides that I stole from Tita Reddington, who directs the ASPCA's foster program out of LA, and just gave a webinar actually on our ASPCA Pro about her OnDeck system. So I handily stole some of her information. And I wanted to touch on, so the graphic on the left describes their whole system. But I wanted to touch on kind of the bottom of that graphic and how they manage their OnDeck system is they use a survey, they use Smartsheet. And so they have their foster caregivers input information into this survey, ask questions, their contact information, when are they available to start fostering, who can they take, say bottle babies, can they take a queen, can they take a ringworm kitten? That information goes into a spreadsheet that they check every day. And how their system works is that they are intaking animals from the LA County shelters. So they are proactively seeking out what kittens they can handle on any given day. So they use that roster to see how many homes they have available. They intake that number of litters or kittens, and then they send them out into foster care. And when those foster homes pick up a kitten or a litter, they get removed from the spreadsheet. And then one thing that I think is actually really savvy that I haven't seen before, except in our LA program, is that then rather than try to maintain this, kind of maintain that themselves, they put the onus on the foster caregiver to then resubmit the survey when they're ready again. And so that same process kind of repeats itself. The foster caregiver inputs information into the survey, it populates into their spreadsheet, and so on and so forth. And they've made some tweaks to try to streamline that system and make it as user-friendly as possible for the foster caregiver. The ASPCA is also doing foster care out of its adoption center and kitten nursery in New York. They're using a very similar system. They have actually only really recently kind of really embraced the OnDeck idea, and so they're doing the same thing where they've got a survey, which there's just some screenshots of what the survey looks like from the foster caregiver's perspective. So they have a survey that auto-populates into an Excel document. And then I wanted to briefly touch on the shelter software and how they're using that. So they're using PetPoint. And in PetPoint, they have a number of different templates so in the kittens record, they auto-populate with these templates that basically have instructions for the foster caregiver. So that's a little bit more about how they're doing the communication sort of on the back end. Once that kitten is there and when that pickup is happening, it can make the process very efficient to utilize some of your shelter software templates. And last but not least, just to touch a little bit about the Animal Rescue View Boston, because that's where I've had most of my direct practical experience with the OnDeck system. We started using an OnDeck system back in 2008, and we had a consult from Dr. Sandra Newberry, who recommended it as part of our overall kind of effort to improve our feline population management. And so when we first started, as I've alluded to, we basically just had an Excel document that the foster caregiver information was pulled out of Chameleon, which was the shelter software we were using, that they still are using, put it into an Excel document, and kind of just kept that as a rotating roster. And whoever was, kind of up next would be notified, you guys are up next for a foster kitten, then they would be contacted, and so on and so forth. The ARL has actually shifted over time, and at first glance I kind of debated about, is their current system really an OnDeck system? But ultimately, what I think, starting off with that original Excel document and that original format, what it did is it created a mindset shift at the ARL. So they developed this sense of urgency to get foster kittens out the door as quickly as possible. So ultimately, using that Excel document became something that that wasn't as user-friendly and wasn't as necessary with the shifting intake needs of kittens. There are just frankly less kittens coming in the door. And so they revamped their system per foster parent request and actually now use a closed Facebook group. This is the volunteer group. It's a little bit different. That's a closed foster group, but I'm not in that group, so I didn't have access for the screenshot to that. So basically now information about animals needing foster care get posted into this closed Facebook group. So it's a little bit less proactive than a foster care OnDeck system ideally is. And I don't know, it's got its pros and cons, but again, the format is very easy for the foster caregivers to use. And it works because foster care is being utilized a lot more for a variety of populations, and so this allows for some more flexibility. And again, there is still that onus about making the system efficient. So it just kind of highlights that there's some room for flexibility. And last but not least, before I open it up to questions, we implemented foster care OnDeck as part of a kind of overhaul of our feline population management system and trying to really focus in on our length of stay for cats. So the data that I have up on the screen, it only goes up to 2013 because we sort of modified how we were tracking data, so it would be comparing apples to oranges. But the length of stay has continued to decrease. And so what this length of stay is, it's not just length of stay from intake to sending out to foster care, because even that 4 days would be too long for that. But this is overall length of stay for kittens, both from intake to foster care and then foster return to adoption and kittens that come in that don't need foster care. The reason that I put it up is just to highlight that as one part of a comprehensive population management protocol, it's made a huge difference. And so I can definitely speak to personal experience with how much benefit you can see in the health of your kittens with a foster OnDeck system. And so, without further ado, I will open it up to questions. And since my first picture of me had our previous dog in it, I wanted to show my cat, since we are talking about cats, and this is a cat audience. So this is my cat, Edward, whom I share an office space with and who is lying next to me as we speak. When he was a tiny baby when I took him home, and then as an old man at 13 now. So I'll happily open up to any questions. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Erin, and thank you, Edward, very much. For introducing or expanding on this idea for us, because it does seem almost like a simple idea. Hey, let's have a plan for the kittens that come every year. But as your last slide showed, the results are anything but small. An entire week shaved off of length of stay for each kitten is huge, just to get ahead of the plan. I mean, ahead of the game and make a plan.
Absolutely.
All right, you have some questions ready to go. So, first one, does PetPoint send the foster an email with the information?
Not that I know how to do. So I think that's a qualified no. So this is information that we are printing out essentially for the foster parent, or it could be sort of manually emailed. But to the best of my knowledge, there is not any sort of auto information that is sent. I know some of the newer shelter softwares like Shelter Love are trying to further kind of streamline the system and may have some additional advances in that regard. But I have not seen a system that I have experience with that sort of automatically does that for you.
If anybody out there knows how to hack PetPoint to do this, please send us a comment so we can share with everybody.
For sure.
What is in your OnDeck survey?
So the OnDeck survey, so the LA team at the ASPCA was who really pioneered this survey, and they have streamlined it over the years to make it user-friendly, especially because they're using that for people to kind of re-up and say when they're ready to take another. So foster parents are filling this out a lot. So they've tried to streamline it. It basically just is, who are you? When's your date? When can you take a kitten? And then basic questions about what you can manage. And it's really basically just, can you take in a bottle baby? Can you treat ringworm? Can you treat URI? Can you take in a queen? Just the very, very basics are what's included in that survey.
I love how you mentioned to try hard to not go to those known volunteers, no cherry picking. because even though you know Judy, as you said, is going to take those kittens, you're not giving everybody else an opportunity to step up. And Judy is tired and probably dealing with ringworm and burnout and everything else. You have to spread the love.
That's true. And Judy is a real person that I is a real foster caregiver, so that's true. Hopefully she doesn't mind.
We see you, Judy.
But it's all complimentary. yeah. Yeah. But totally, it's such an easy trap to fall into. I am guilty as anybody else of trying to cherry pick people, but it's really not an ideal system for efficiency or for, having an equitable system. Yeah, there's plenty of other people. Exactly. Yes, that too.
Can you share a link to your online foster orientation? And if you don't have it handy, we can, of course, add that to the Maddie's Pet Forum after-show discussion.
So I don't have the link myself, but I can certainly share is there was I think that Tina Reddington, again, she just gave a webinar through ASPCA Pro. The ASPCA is very big on our foster stuff, getting the word out right now. So I would be happy in the forum afterwards to share a link to the information that they have, and that is included.
Wonderful. Yeah. And when we post this on the Million Cat Challenge website, we'll also put the link with the webinar, everybody. Okay. How long after fostering kittens with ringworm should foster homes wait to foster again?
Ooh, that's a good question. I love the more disease-based question. That's definitely in my wheelhouse. So I think that there's been a reliance on timelines for disease management in the past, and it really comes down less to about time and more about the actions that you take to clean and disinfect the home. So what I have done as a system for fosters that have had ringworm is a thorough cleaning is the first and foremost. It's just all about the vacuuming and the Swiffering and disinfecting the surfaces that can be disinfected. Once they've done that, what I have done, and it depends a little bit on the scenario, but is use things, say like a Swiffer, and then cultured the part of that Swiffer. And I know there's another webinar all about ringworm, so I don't want to overstep or kind of steal the spotlight there. And then actually done a DTM culture on that Swiffer mop, or they can use a toothbrush culture in their home. Culture that, and if that is clear, then clear the home again. Even that might be overkill if there's a really thorough disinfecting, but I have every once in a while had a home that is still contaminated with ringworm after doing that Swiffer culture process, and so it's been useful to guide going back in and doing sort of a repeat cleaning. But there's not a specific timeline associated with that other than the amount of time to monitor that culture.
All right, thank you for that, Erin. This is kind of a broad question, but a very important one. How do you use social media?
That's a loaded question too. I definitely can't pretend to have a perfect answer to that. How the ARL volunteer and foster directors use social media, they are using it in different platforms. So there are closed groups for the volunteers and the foster parents, and that's totally separate from the Facebook that the public would see. That is more about kind of marketing and development and all those sorts of things. So in these closed groups, they're used as a platform both for, so how the ARL is doing it right now is they're using it as a platform both for the staff to communicate with the foster parents about animals that need foster care, and then also for the foster caregivers to communicate amongst each other. I think how the ASPCA is doing it, and how I think can be a little bit, depending on what your needs are, can be a better system if you have a larger foster network, is to have that communication system for the staff to the foster caregivers be separate, so that can be a very efficient and organized system, but still maintain a closed Facebook group or other social media platform group that the foster caregivers can communicate amongst each other, because I think that's a really lovely format to have, because oftentimes there's some stuff that other foster caregivers can really provide better advice to than even the staff can, just in terms of practicalities of fostering.
That's such a good point. It's important to have a community, too, and to have a network of other people fostering. And Laura, just in case you were also wondering about recruitment with social media, there are a lot of great organizations out there recruiting for foster parents, but if you haven't already swung by the Kitten Ladies Facebook page, oh man, she is just killer at recruiting for foster parents. She makes fostering cool, so make sure you check out the Kitten Lady. Okay, we have time for just one last question, and so in no particular order, I'm just going to pick one. Do you worry about other diseases, example, after a litter with calicivirus?
Yes, you do worry, although I think sometimes it's easy to slip into overkill. So I think in general, I mean, it's a whole, I could get into a whole other lecture on sort of all the ins and outs of disease management in foster care. In general, you want to advise your foster caregivers to keep their foster kittens in an area that is easy to clean. And so that helps you just no matter what your kittens might be shedding, because sometimes we know, and sometimes honestly kittens might be shedding stuff that they're not clinical for and we don't know. So it's just always a good idea to be able to do a thorough cleaning after you've had foster kittens in your home. And so when you start to talk about specific diseases like panleukopenia, like calicivirus, like ringworm, there can be very streamlined and specific recommendations that go along with it. But in general, you're going to be set up for success if you're advising foster caregivers to be thoughtful about where they keep their kittens in their home. And there's often still good opportunity for socialization and play, even when they're kept, say, in a bathroom or in the kitchen or whatever the individual circumstances might work best.
Man, that 30 minutes flew by. We still have questions pouring in and so many left unanswered, which I just hate, but all the more reason to check your resource widget for those links. We're going to head over to Maddie's Pet Forum. All of the questions that are here can be answered there. Any more that you have will also be answered over there. And, of course, I can't help but notice a lot of these are ringworm questions. So we're going to stop for one moment while you all open your calendars right now. Let's do it together. This one's important. On March 27th, 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, we are fighting fungus with facts. We have a whole hour to dive into ringworm, and I'm sure there'll be lots of great foster questions there too. Erin, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for being here with us and presenting this wonderful idea.
Thank you for having me. It was fun.
Of course, and everybody out there, have a great day. We'll see you on the 27th. We'll see you in the Maddie's Pet Forum, and don't forget, your links are in the widget. Have a great day, everybody.